Hello everyone and welcome to NAPCAN's Anti-Poverty Week webinar called Keeping Children Safe from Poverty. My name's Helen Fogerty. I'm NAPCAN's Communications Manager. I usually specialise in doing things behind the scenes and making other people be in front of the camera, but due to unforeseen circumstances, here I am, which kind of serves me right because I spent a lot of time making other people do these things. I'd like to start by acknowledging and paying my respects to the Turrbal and Yagara people, the traditional custodians of the land where I am today in Brisbane. I know we have people here from all parts of Australia, so I'd like to also pay my respects to the people, the custodians of the lands where you are today. Feel free to share that in the chat. Unfortunately, in GoToWebinar, that you can't see each other's conversation, but it's still nice to know where people are. We really like to particularly acknowledge the children in these communities because that's where the culture will live on. And also, I'd like to acknowledge the devastating impact of colonisation on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I think that's particularly relevant to our conversation today because it's had a really big impact on financial inequality in this country. So that's and also, of course, a particular welcome to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are logged on today. Now, before we get into the webinar, I'll just quickly do a bit of housekeeping. If you're not familiar with GoToWebinars, it's a great program, but it is a little unfamiliar for a lot of people. So over on the right-hand side, you have a control panel. There's not too much to worry about there. There is a chat function, but everyone who's in the audience is in listen-only mode, so you can't accidentally pop up or put your audio on. So you don't need to worry about that. I've been guilty of having those kinds of problems in the past, so that's always a big kind of relief to me that it can't happen in GoToWebinar. In the chat function, we will be sharing a little bit of information throughout the webinar. And I think the only thing in there at the moment maybe is a little document that's about some of the technical issues. So if you do have any problems with technical issues, just send something into the question and we'll try and help you out. We'd also like you to send in questions that you have for the speakers. So that would be great. And the webinar is being recorded. So that's often one of the main questions that we have. Will it be recorded? We'll send out an email to everyone who's registered in the next week, and we also like to send out a resource sheet, so we include all the links in that. So yeah, that'll all be coming out in due course, and it's reassuring if you do have a little bit of trouble with your audio or anything along the way. You've got that as the backup. Now for a bit of background about today's webinar. As you probably all know by now, this is Anti-Poverty Week this week. And this year, the week is focused on child and family poverty. So it makes it really relevant for organisations like NAPCAN, we're the National Association for Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect. And of course, poverty is a really big part of the conversation around child abuse and neglect. And this year in National Child Protection Week, we had the theme of every child in every community needs a fair go. And during that week, there was a lot of conversations that did come back to poverty and inequality. The term postcode lottery was used a lot, and we're really happy to be able to kind of continue this conversation this week and get some really great speakers to come and help us with that conversation. Just by way of what we'll be doing today, firstly, we'll be hearing from Professor Sharon Bessel. She's from the Australian National University. She'll be presenting some fascinating research into child poverty, and importantly, that is from the perspective of children themselves. So we're really looking forward to hearing that. And then we'll be hearing from Angela Rondo from the Our Community, Our Families, Our Children project, which is on the Sunshine Coast. And that's going to give us some really great practical examples about how we can kind of work together to protect children from poverty. And thank you to both Sharon and Angela, who've really had to do quite a bit of rearranging to be here with us today. So I'm very grateful to both of those. So without any further ado, I'll invite Sharon Bessel onto the screen. Sharon, as I said, is from the Australian National University. She's a professor at the Crawford School of Public Policy, and she's also the director of the Children's Policy Centre and the Poverty and Inequality Research Centre. So we couldn't think of a better person to have here to have this conversation today than Sharon. And we're also particularly excited to have her back because she has had a bit to do with NAPCAN over the years, and we've been involved with research with her in the past. So we're kind of thrilled to invite her back into the fold and to hear what she has to tell us about child poverty. Over to you, Sharon.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be part of this event today. Thank you, Helen, Sammy, Nadia, and everyone at NAPCAN for organising this event. And thank you for the work that you do. I've got some slides to share, so I am going to attempt to share my screen. This is always the moment of truth when we see whether it all actually works. Helen, can you see my screen now? I am hoping and assuming that you can all see my screen. Is that okay, Helen?
Well done.
Lovely, perfect. Thanks, everyone. As I said, that's always the most nerve-wracking moment of any presentation. I also wanted today to thank Tony Wren and to the Anti-Poverty Week organisers for their incredible efforts all year round to shine a light on the reality of poverty in this very wealthy country that we live in. I'm joining you today from the south of Canberra. I'm on Ngunnawal country. This is land that has never been ceded. And I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to all traditional owners of this beautiful land. And I pay my respects to all First Nations people who are joining us for this webinar today. So today I wanted to share with you some of my research on multidimensional child poverty and to share some thoughts on how we can begin to think about not only the ways in which we can support and keep children safe when they and their families are living in context of poverty, but how we can begin to get to the causes of poverty and to address some of the systemic failures as a means of keeping all children safe from poverty. Excuse me. This work has its origins in an Australian Research Council linkage project that we undertook about a decade ago. And I did that research with the wonderful Professor Jan Mason from the University of Western Sydney, who some of you probably know. Jan's done a lot of work in Australia around children's wellbeing. And that research was in partnership with NAPCAN and the Benevolent Society. And it is so lovely to continue this long connection with NAPCAN. I'm sorry, I seem to have got a frog in my throat. So the Children and Communities research used a range of participatory methods with children aged between around 7 and 13, so children in middle childhood, to understand what makes strong and supportive communities for children. 6 of the communities that we worked in 6 communities overall, and 4 of those communities were categorised as disadvantaged on a range of ABS indicators. The families of many of the children who participated in the research were really struggling financially, but in a range of ways. And from that research, we were able to gain deep insights from children into what it's like to grow up in contexts of poverty. Children in that research from a range of different socioeconomic backgrounds talked to us about the importance of community and the importance of food in community. And they talked about the way in which sharing food brought people together and created connections. And you can see that quote on your screen from a young girl who was 9. She said, "I think neighbours are really important in community because like my neighbours, we both have a veggie patch. And sometimes we give them food that they don't have and they give us food in return." So this is sharing. Everyone's got enough, but they're sharing. But for some children, there was no food to share. This 9-year-old boy explained to us that good neighbours are those who gave his family food when they could not afford to buy it themselves. And he talked about skipping breakfast, he talked about feeling hungry, and he talked about knowing that his mum went without so that he and his brothers and sisters could eat. An 11-year-old girl talked about how her mum had no money left after all the bills were paid. She talked about the things that she longed to do, but never asked to do because she knew that her mum didn't have the money. She also talked about avoiding being too close to others at school because she didn't want them to know that she couldn't afford to do some of the things that she couldn't afford to do some of the things that they did. And she shared with us her sense of shame. This was not shame of her mum. She talked about how much she loved her mum and how hard her mum worked to hold things together, but she felt ashamed about the situation. So these quotes give us some indication of how poverty impacts on the lives of children. It impacts in terms of a lack of food, also in terms of insecure housing, having to move regularly, sometimes having to stay with other people in between having rental properties or places to live. Children also talked about not being able to take part in school excursions, in sport, and in a range of activities. And like that girl I just quoted, many children talked about the strategies that they used to try to protect their parents, to not ask for things that they knew couldn't be afforded. Children also talked about their parents' stress, and they talked about their parents' precarious, insecure, and sometimes dangerous and exhausting work, and what that meant for them. From this research, we developed what we call the Community Jigsaw. This identified the pieces that children considered to be particularly important if communities are to be strong and supportive places for everyone, regardless of age, but particularly for children. When all the pieces are in place, children felt that communities are, or would be, good places to live. But as the pieces fall away, children felt less secure. Their well-being and their connectedness was undermined. And we grouped these pieces that children identified into 4 broad themes: into relationships, physical places, safety, and resources. What was striking, although perhaps not surprising, was the ways in which disadvantage and poverty impacted on the extent to which these pieces were in place for children. Equally striking was the value children placed on relationships, not only with parents and immediate family members and friends, but also relationships within the broader community. And children talked about the value of strong and supportive intergenerational relationships, as well as relationships with their peers. Children spoke of the ways in which financial hardship impacted on their relationships with parents and the time they were able to spend together. Children spoke of intense pressure that their parents were under, of unpaid bills, of precarious work, of parents' exhaustion and stress. So I want to go from that work, which has been the basis of the research that we're doing at the ANU around, and in the Children's Policy Centre, around poverty and around children and communities, to look particularly at poverty and multidimensional poverty. Relative income poverty is defined by the OECD as people who have less than 50% of median disposable income. In Australia, we don't have an official poverty line, but we generally take that definition as our definition of poverty. In Australia, prior to COVID-19, almost 18% of children, that's 1 in every 6 children, lived in relative income poverty. In 2020, some strange things happened. The rates of poverty actually declined for some groups because coronavirus supplements increased the incomes of people who were on working age benefits. In Australia, income poverty is closely associated with very low levels of those working age benefits, which keep people below the poverty line. Single parent families, and particularly single mother families, are most likely to live in poverty. And we have in Australia a very punitive approach to welfare, with strong conditionality around the welfare system. And we've all heard the stories about robo-debt and the conditionality that people face. People, including parents, are required to demonstrate that they are actively seeking work, and single parents must demonstrate that they're seeking work by the time their youngest child reaches 8 years of age. But of course, a great deal of work is not friendly to children and does not enable people to provide the time and the care that children need. So very often there are trade-offs between income and between time with children. And I'll add here that in the research we've done with children, time with parents is a resource that children value most, but which is often in shorter supply. Children have described to us how they understand this, and they often try not to make too many demands on their parents' time. They recognise that it's not the fault of their parents. And of course, these issues relate to the structure of our economy and our labour force, and it relates to what, as a society, we are signalling that we value most, and that is not the care of children. Now, I'm not for a moment here suggesting that paid work isn't important and doesn't have value in and of itself, but I am asking whether we've got the balance right in the ways we think about paid employment around welfare and benefits and around support for children. So in protecting children from poverty, a very clear step forward is to increase incomes and also to address the very high costs of housing. And that's a particular focus of this year's Anti-Poverty Week. Increasing the rate of working age benefits and increasing the supply of social housing are strategies that would make an immediate difference. But if we want to genuinely ensure that children do not grow up in poverty, we do need to focus on more than income, as well as keeping our focus on income, because income alone is unlikely to be enough. If we think of poverty as a wall that prevents children and their families from living the kinds of lives that they wish to, then some things are clearly related to income, but some things are not. Sufficient increases in income may mean that families can now afford things like health care, like food, and perhaps dental care, and perhaps secure housing are finally in reach. But reducing the proportion of people in income poverty may mean relatively small increases in money for many, taking them from just below that 50% of median income to just above it, but not fundamentally changing their lives. Many of the structural barriers are still in place, and many of the systems we have are still failing. And as I said, sometimes increasing income requires those trade-offs that make other aspects of life more problematic and harder, including aspects of life that matter most to children. So over the past several years, beginning with our Children and Communities research and moving on from then, with a number of colleagues, I've been doing research on multidimensional child poverty. And similar work has been happening all around the world to help us to better understand the impacts of poverty on children's lives and how we can address it. So in this work, we have conceptualized child poverty as being about income but more, as being about material and non-material, as being both social and relational. We think about poverty as being shaped by age, by particularly youth, by gender, by generation, by ability or disability, by geographic location. And we need to understand all of these things in order to be able to respond to the causes of poverty. And we also think about poverty as fundamentally a denial of human rights and dignity. This conceptualisation isn't our own. It's based on the research that we've done with children over a number of years in Australia and also in the region, including in Indonesia. And my colleague Angie Bexley has been central to that work in Indonesia, as is Clara Siagian. So from that conceptualisation of poverty, we've developed this definition of poverty, which is the interplay between material and key non-material deprivations that prevent learning, developing and playing, that prevent a child from participating in society and living with dignity both now and in the future. And from that definition and from our research with children, we've developed a framework, the More for Children framework, which is designed to help us to think about the extent and the nature of the problem, but also to help us with our responses. So let me tell you just a little bit about this framework, the More for Children framework. And today, the Children Policy Centre at the ANU has released a discussion paper on this framework. It's on our website, and either I or Helen can email it to you if you would like a copy. So the framework has 3 dimensions of poverty. It has material deprivation, which is insufficient money and material resources to meet basic needs. It has a dimension of opportunity deprivation, and these are barriers to quality services and to meaningful activities that contribute to children's participation and ongoing development. And the 3rd dimension is what we're referring to as relational deprivation. This is particularly important for children, and it's the existence of structural factors that undermine strong and supportive relationships. So when we talk about relational deprivation, this is not the fault of families. This is around those structural factors that prevent those strong supportive relationships that children need. We do need in this work to do much more research around the appropriateness of the framework for First Nations children and their families in particular. But the lack of opportunity to connect to culture and to country, and the lack of relationships that support strong connection to culture and to country are essential for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. And deprivation in these dimensions is the result of discrimination and systems failures on the part of dominant white settler policies. More broadly, when we've undertaken research with children, they've talked a great deal about the opportunities they miss as a result of living in contexts of poverty. This is sometimes due to a lack of income in the family, but often due to a lack of infrastructure, a lack of services, and a lack of activities within their communities. Children have talked about the ways in which the stress of income poverty and of insecurity impacts on their relationships with their parents, whose lives are shaped by the pressures of poverty. And children have also talked about how those issues and those pressures manifest within their communities, impacting often on relationships. Children have also talked about the enormous strengths within their families and within their communities. And often those strengths exist despite of, and often because of, the structural causes of poverty and the system's failures that families simply have to cope with, and which children have to cope with from a very young age. And the children that we have undertaken research with are incredibly resilient. But the question that I ask is, should children have to be resilient enough to cope with the extraordinary hardship that is created by systems that are letting them down? Of course, deprivation in one dimension of this multidimensional framework does not necessarily mean poverty, except for perhaps in the dimension of material deprivation. But where these dimensions overlap, we see deep multidimensional poverty. And many of the children that we've done research with have been living in this situation. So in the last 5 minutes or so of this presentation, I wanted to think through some of the implications of all of this and to ask how we keep children safe from poverty. So let me just once again go through what children have told us about their experiences of living in contexts of poverty, and to look at that through this framework of material opportunity and relational deprivation. So children talk about deep material deprivation, which is around the costs of food, of housing, costs associated with education. And while education is ostensibly free in Australia, there are many costs associated with it. And children have talked to us about the challenges they face because of that. Children also talk about the costs of healthcare. And it's striking to hear, and it's confronting to hear an 8-year-old talk about them or their parents or grandparents not being able to afford healthcare when they need it. So these things all relate to material deprivation and shape children's lives fundamentally. Children have also talked, as I've already said, about the pay and conditions of employment that their parents face, of the stresses that their parents face through conditionality that are placed around working age benefits or welfare benefits. Children talk about the very long hours that their parents sometimes work and the unsociable nature of those hours, parents having to pick up extra hours at night or on the weekends, the precarity of work and what that means for time together, parents' inability to find work, and the pressures that manifest when parents can't find work. and the stress that their parents are continually under. And all of this has implications for children's lives, for the time they spend with their families. What's striking is how much children know about the pressures that their parents are facing and how much they try to hide their knowledge of those pressures from their families. When we talk about opportunity deprivation, we're talking, as I said, about a lack of access to services and to experiences. But this is also very closely related, not just to the cost of those activities, but to attitudes and to values. And children have talked in detail to us about not being able to engage in activities that they would like to, not just because of the cost, but because of issues around shame and stigma and exclusion. So let's move from that to have a look at the ways in which I would argue there has been a failure on the part of governments of all persuasions over many years to keep children safe from poverty. And I think there are a number of policies that either create and or exacerbate child poverty. Over the course of this week, we'll be hearing a lot about the Raise the Rate campaign and a lot about the need for more social housing. And this is absolutely fundamental to the things that we need to do to protect children from material deprivation. We also need to think about policies around employment policy, around the labour market, around growing precarity, and around the protection that workers have, because this impacts so fundamentally on the situation that families find themselves in, and it impacts directly on children's time and relationships with their parents, and more broadly with relationships within the community. And we need to think about the way in which welfare conditionality is impacting on children's relationships with their parents and more broadly with their communities. And I think perhaps most fundamentally, we need to focus a light on and to challenge and to demand an end to discriminatory policy narratives around entitlement and deservingness. You know, we might remember that some of these narratives reached a particular crescendo when the former Treasurer Joe Hockey, about eight or so years ago, talked about Australia's lifters or leaners. But that's just one very explicit example of this narrative that implicitly and often explicitly criticises and blames people for their own situations rather than addressing the underlying structural causes. So we urgently need to shift those narratives. So to keep children safe from poverty, we need a new narrative, and we need a transformative vision of what we want this wealthy country to be and what we want for all our children. We need a recognition that children have a right under the Convention on the Rights of the Child to a decent standard of living. And we need a recognition that poverty is a common rights violation in Australia. We need to embed children's views and experiences into decision-making processes so that we know that we are addressing those things that impact so dramatically on children's lives. And we need to be able to systematically review policies for their impact on child poverty through a child-centred framework. And as I said, we need to shift that narrative in order to end stigma. So we need three key commitments from across the political spectrum, from the media, from our political and our public leaders. We need a recognition of children's rights, we need accountability to children, and we need a respect for the dignity of all children, and indeed all people regardless of their age. And in saying this, I'm very conscious of the incredible work that's already being done by so many organisations to support children and their families, often in contexts of disadvantage. And I know that Angela will be talking about the phenomenal work that she's doing through the Nambour Community Centre. We do need to ensure that when children are in contexts of poverty, they are supported and they're kept safe. But what I'm arguing is that we also need to get to the root causes. And that is how we can begin to protect all children from poverty. So one way of starting this process in a very practical step is through child impact assessments of all policies to determine what the impact will be on multidimensional child poverty. We need child-centred analysis to genuinely understand how policies will impact on children and to ensure that policies are not harming children, as some currently are. And the More for Children framework is one means of undertaking that analysis. And as we further develop this work, we hope that it will be taken up by policymakers and others. Child-centred analysis has the potential to ensure child-inclusive policies. Now, it's possible that we may not always be able to be or want to be child-centred, that is, putting children at the absolute centre and prioritised over all else. There are many interests at stake, and those interests may be competing. But we should always strive to be child-inclusive, ensuring that at a minimum, children are considered and that they are not harmed, and keeping children safe from poverty must become a priority. And if we are to be child inclusive, then we need to genuinely listen to the views and the experience of children in all their diversity, and we need to be prepared to act in partnership. Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you so much, Sharon. I really, I was really looking forward to hearing your presentation, and it's so wonderful to hear you explain the multi-dimensions of poverty. And the children's quotes are always so impactful, particularly I think around, for me, that, hearing what those children say about the feelings of shame. And there's so much more that we probably will be able to come back to with some questions at the end. But no, that was just wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay, so I'll let Sharon have a break, and now I'll be inviting Angela up to the screen. Angela Rondo she coordinates the Thriving Families program at Nambour Community Centre. She is involved with an amazing project that's happening on the Sunshine Coast called Our Community, Our Families, Our Children. And this project won a Queensland Child Protection Week award not long ago, and I was at those awards. I met Angela there, and I was so interested in the work that they've done. And although it's not specifically about poverty, when we were doing this webinar, someone suggested that it would be a really good case study for us. So I was lucky to be able to get Angela to come today. She's a very busy person, and she's had to rearrange a few things to make this work. But really, really keen to have a bit of a chat today.
Thank you, Helen.
Yeah. Thanks, Angela. So we're just going to have a little bit of a chat, and we'll sort of go through the project. So you just feel free to add what you need to add. But and if you want to introduce a little bit more about what you do, I don't know if I've done a great job of that. But if we just start by explaining the project, a little bit of an overview and how it came about.
Sure. Before I start, you did a great job, Helen. And I'd like. And I would like to also just acknowledge where I'm sitting today. I'm sitting on Kabi Kabi Gubbi Gubbi land, and I'd like to acknowledge the elders that have been before, those who are present and among us now, and the emerging leaders of the future who get to continue the dreaming and looking after this amazing country. And as I was saying to you earlier, I've purposely put the green behind me just because that green wealth that I was talking about and having environmental wealth is so important to us. Thank you also, Sharon, for acknowledging the work we do. I really appreciate that, and I really enjoyed hearing your understanding of poverty and the impact it has on children, and the descriptions and demonstration, the visual demonstration with your visual jigsaw and those blocks of barriers that families, that's really powerful to be able to observe. So in 2019, the local area alliance came together on the Sunshine Coast in group with concerns about a particular community that Thriving Families already work in, and as a part of those concerns that were raised, we elected to build a group of keen services who would like to respond and hopefully build social wealth and individual wealth within this community. So we came together. We meet monthly and fortnightly to discuss what we're experiencing in this community and what sort of areas we can achieve or opportunities we see where we can have a positive impact. So I'd also just like to acknowledge the members of that team who won the award and where we were able to meet with you, Helen. So the Family and Child Connect team, the Department of Housing and Digital Economy, Child Youth Justice and Multicultural Affairs representative, our favourite Queensland Police representative, and also I'd really like to pay my respect and my humility around the team that I get to work with every day and work in this community. That is the Thriving Families team at Nambour Community Centre. They inspire me every day I go into work, so I'm very privileged. So since 2019, this group of people have been meeting and working in a community where I think when I think about the jigsaw that Sharon presented, it was the insecure housing. Is so significant. I mean, it's all interrelated and multidimensional, as you're saying, but I was just thinking about living in an inadequate dwelling with no tenure and no capacity for these small people or the community as a whole to have any control over positive relationships or relationships that they get to build in this space. It is often always from a deficit, that poverty space that they are working from. So we really wanted to change the narrative and shift our work in that space and build wealth. So every time we go in with the intention to build wealth. And how do we do that? And build the community wealth. So we're looking to reduce community violence, looking to reduce community hunger, harm by alcohol and other drugs, you know, and increase the knowledge and understanding of other services that are attending that community too.
Thanks, Angela. That's a pretty good summary. I think I'm going to keep asking you more and more. I was going to ask you a bit about how you do work together with those other groups, because I think that's what's so incredible about this particular project. But I think you've already sort of talked about the diversity of those groups. One of the things we thought was really amazing about this project is that you didn't actually have additional funding to say. No one sort of said, oh, here's a community that needs support, and here's a whole heap of money to help you. You had to use your smarts to be able to sort of identify the problems and then work with the resources that you already had and the people and the relationships. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about that.
I suppose all funded service delivery, and I know I'm going to speak for Thriving Families now, I see that the work we do is incredible with the amount of funding we receive, and so we'll consider that we are a poor service also. And so we have the social wealth as social workers and community workers to build relationships. So we're very privileged in that space, and I think that's what it is about. Organisations recognising what they do have and the individual employees, workers in those groups, that passion and commitment to communities and children in this instance, coming together and finding creative ways to share the resources that we do have, share our knowledge and our skills with each other and opportunities. So, for instance, part of this group is that access to public transport for the community in which we're responding to can be really poor, and also you hear horrible stories of bus drivers just continuing to drive on by because of the discrimination and their own fear base around perceptions for the community. So we were donated a bus, so Thriving Families was donated a bus to support transporting children to and from school in the morning, because aside from bus drivers not stopping, the timetable just doesn't meet kids accessing school unless they're up at 7:15 ready to go, or at 10:15, there is no way they're going to get. So, and we talk about those structural barriers. Transport's a big one.
That's
so
great.
We were able to receive that bus. Yeah.
That's wonderful. I was going to ask you a little bit more about that, because I think, you know, Sharon talked about it. It's not just the material deprivation, but the opportunities and the relationships. And I think people are really interested in hearing about some of those practical things that you did, like overcoming the public transport. I know there were things like the relocating services, and so you have a very long list. But if you wanted to talk a little bit more about some of those other examples of how you just changed the delivery without having to have brand new services.
So some of the practice for Thriving Families is always a relational one. It's always comes from a community development lens, and having worked in this particular community for 5 years, a little bit longer maybe, we've been able to build really significant relationships with the community. So some of it is about awareness raising and helping to change that narrative and that understanding, that perspective. So bringing on the journey other service providers or delivery systems. So we've been able to invite in outreach doctors. So on the Sunshine Coast or in Queensland, we have Sunny Street, which deliver GP services to at-risk communities, and they come into the community. So bringing services in or bringing opportunities into the community is really important, so that people don't have to go out, first negotiate a transport system which has discriminatory barriers in itself, and then once we're out of there, you know, accessing the different points of connection for families. So taking them in, introducing, building relationships. Aside from that, we have had lots of other services prior to COVID coming into the community, holding health and well-being sort of activity in the community. So bringing Sunshine Coast Council in to vaccinate animals and treat animals, desexing of animals, so we're not having lots of cats running around or puppies being used as commodity. We able to, you know, support those engagement pathways, and we do that with all of our different connections and partners on the coast here. It's a really important collaboration, and you see it so significantly when we get to come together and look at the outcomes. And another outcome is about bringing in needle exchange programs so that we can reduce the number of needles where there is an active population who need these. We can reduce them being left, and so there's proper processes for individuals to have clean, you know, health, medical needs for themselves as well as disposal.
It's amazing. I think the project is so holistic, and I think sometimes at the level that we're working, there's a lot of talk about how do we break down silos and how do we work together, and then I look at these projects on the ground, and I think you're doing that every single day, and and you can so clearly see that big picture and those root causes that Sharon talked about as well. You know, you can see the whole picture, and you've got it there sort of under a microscope almost. So it's wonderful. Yeah, as much as I like kittens and puppies, you know, there is a
not okay sometimes. We have a high density living arrangement.
Yeah. I think in one of your project reports, I know that we have to be careful of privacy. You did have a couple of case studies, just a little stories about a couple of the families. Did you have anything that you wanted to share there? Because I think those give us a really clear picture of how these things can change someone's life.
So I think importantly, you know, we don't often want to displace people, but one of the key, or we don't want to report about a reduction in number of children living in a certain community, but a key partnership has been with our local housing department and recognising the harm that children have experienced in this very poor community, and I use the word poor, it's with so many of those dimensions that Sharon spoke to, finding other opportunities, so building the relationship with housing and seeing that families can access or be a priority to access secure, safe, affordable housing in a community that is supportive to their needs. So we have seen many families, but one in particular is a very young family of First Nation. It's a First Nations couple who found themselves within this poor community, and we're finding that being within the environment that they weren't able to build the social capital or the social wealth that they were needing, and feeling more depressed and anxious and isolated. And with a small 2-year-old, not even then at that time, probably less than 1, but with a very small child, you can see how this can spiral into something a lot more detrimental long term. So the relationship with housing, that pathway and that acknowledgement of families who would benefit from, you know, a speedy exit from this community into a more healthy one, has been really positive. And now we're seeing this family attending daycare, education, participating in the development and the community engagement with NAIDOC this year that we support, driver's license, all the things that they're looking for, and access, you know, engaging with their employment network, you know, doing all the things.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that story, Angela. I think it's also really great to see, like, because you're working with services who are all from that area, you're able to continue your relationships with these families, and so I guess that's really important, and that doesn't always happen, and maybe is a little easier in a regional area where you do know everybody, and it can be different challenges in a city, I guess, where people lose touch. And such respect for the housing, for anyone who's working in housing, because I know it's particularly tough on the Sunshine
Coast. At the moment, the Sunshine Coast, and I'm sure it is everywhere. I know I hear from other people, but we certainly are not doing it easy here in terms of the number of people finding themselves homeless for the first time ever.
And I love that you linked back to Sharon's puzzle illustration. And that's, I love that. And it's something that had come up in Sharon's research from years ago. I hadn't seen it for a while. And so, like you, I sort of thought, oh, yeah, that's a sort of sparked my interest. So it would be really an interesting process to kind of be able to apply that to individual communities. And I thought it was really clever that you immediately kind of were able to do that after just seeing it.
I was just because it's so easy to glance up and go, yes. Oh, wow. Yeah.
It is a puzzle. So we will try.
My biggest thing from Sharon was around shifting the narrative.
Yes.
You know, and that the dignity and worth of people.
Yeah.
But
That's
even bringing in things like, you know, back to school haircuts for kids going to school. Like, too many times I've seen haircuts go wrong when they're done at home without a hairdresser, and kids go to school looking, you know. So just providing more opportunity, skating opportunities, so skating clinics during school holidays. We've had cinema nights and access to.
I love those. I love those practical examples. We've got plenty of time. So if you do want to share a few more, we are going to go and do some. We will go to some questions. I think I just was going to ask you a little more about some of the, if you did have a little bit more of those outcomes. I know you did touch a little bit about some of the impressive.
Let me see if I can find where I wrote them down earlier.
I know there were the reductions in crime in that area and the increases in.
I suppose when we think about our colleagues at QPS, and they attend our monthly meetings, and they're able to bring their data with them to the table and let us know. So that feedback is coming quite, you know, in an appropriate time. So we, prior to Thriving Families and Nambour Community Centre entering this community as it did many years ago, QPS reported that they are attending the community up to 3 times a day, maybe 5 times a day, and that it was listed as the highest re-attendance for Queensland Police, even above the places like hospitals, which they go frequently to. So that it was #1 attendance address for them. So to now where they talk about going maybe 3 times a week.
Yeah, amazing.
And other services once upon a time used to talk about not attending this community unless they had a police officer with them, including our child safety representatives wouldn't go into that space without a police officer. That's no longer the case. We see community delivery services going independently all the time. That's not, and we, Thriving Families, lease one of the very small spaces that is in this, at least a small space in this community. So other services can access that as well. So access to a key and use that for confidential conversations or engagements. Yeah.
No, amazing. You really deserve that Child Protection Week award. And I love how kind of the benefits snowball a little bit. So yeah.
And seeing people bringing, and the NDIS also was a really big, so although it's child focused and children are the centre, it really is about community and family as well as the whole, you know, as a whole, because without that safe community, children aren't going to be safe in it. So we also work very closely with the NDIS and having people access packages. And so I really want to, it's a non-child related, but, you know, see a man that had not left his home for 8 years be relocated outside the community, now is thriving and doing activities that fulfill his self-worth and his dignity, and people who have journeyed from residing in this community to now having employment, living outside, having employment, volunteering at our community centre, looking for the broader community, including meals that we share with the identified community. It just, you know, that's why we go back to work every day.
I imagine it's it's really satisfying to be able to see those changes just in a relatively short period of time, which is also really amazing. And and great that you can have be collecting that data as well. So you're seeing changes, but you're also getting some that feedback from the police, and this is really working. So that's really wonderful. I liked also that you mentioned about changing the narrative, and that is thankfully something that's coming up a lot in all of these conversations. And Sharon talked about that. I know Anti-Poverty Week has done a lot of work about how we talk about poverty in a more productive way, and NAPCAN's really interested in a lot of the framing research that's when we're doing our campaigns. So how do we shift this mindset from this sort of individual responsibility out to the whole community and strength based? So I will try to share some things in the chat, a little bit about that sort of some of the research behind that tells us how we can talk about these things more productively.
That would be so awesome. So much of what we do is from a deficit space. Really,
yeah.
As individuals, as a community, there's always that wealth and knowledge and experience that we bring. So, and decentralizing ourselves as workers, as the experts, and allowing people to share and provide their knowledge about their environment, their lives and their experiences, and talk as the expert, then we are richer for understanding, and then be able to invite and bring other people along the journey.
Yeah, oh, that's a really great point. I think your relationships that you have with the community, and also with others are so valuable. That's really the key to your success, and the listening, and as Sharon said, listening to those voices of children and putting their voices into our policy and decision making is key. If there's anything else you particularly want to add, we could bring Sharon back on, and I'll see if we have some questions.
Let's
bring Sharon back. Okay.
Yeah, bring her in.
We'll bring her back. And, yeah. I feel like I've made you talk for quite a while, so thanks. Alrighty, now I'm just going to this another document here to see if I've got some questions. Oh, goody. Alrighty, so people have been sending in questions. I think there are quite a few questions, but there are also lots of really positive comments that were coming in through the chat, and people have been really engaged and interested in what you've both been talking about. So that's just wonderful. So I'm so glad to have you both here. Now, first of all, I have so there's a few questions about how we actually do influence government. So what do you think are the barriers in terms of federal government lifting children out of poverty? I know it is Anti-Poverty Week, and part of the Anti-Poverty Week campaign is about raise the rate and the Everybody's Home, so social housing and increasing welfare payments. So yeah, did either of you like to comment a little bit more about that?
I'm happy to go first if you would like. I think this is one of the great things about Anti-Poverty Week, because it does give us an opportunity to think about the way that all our work connects to this, and to really put these issues into the media spotlight, and to have conversations amongst ourselves, which is really important. I think that the issue of child poverty has to become a far greater political issue in Australia. And I don't say that in a partisan way. I don't think it's particularly helpful to be criticising one side of politics or one government, because the kinds of failures that I've talked about have happened over a very long period of time. They've happened at both state and territory and federal levels, and they've happened across governments of all persuasions. And so I think, the starting point is to make it a political issue, but not a partisan issue. I think what we really need is to advocate in a way that encourages cross-party, cross-government support for this issue. And we know that that can happen. We are in a time of particularly deep political divide at the moment. But I think in our advocacy, we have to continually make the point that this is a very wealthy country. This year, Australia was ranked by Swiss Credit as being the wealthiest country in the world yet again. Now that's in terms of assets and wealth, not in terms of income. But you know, on the Human Development Index that the United Nations produces every year, we're consistently in the top 10. So we're actually doing very well, but we are not doing very well for those children and families and communities that we're leaving behind. And I think we have to continually advocate that we can afford to do better, and we must do better if we are to make this the kind of just, egalitarian country we like to think it is. And so I really think, you know, the work that Angela's doing is just phenomenal, and we have to support that work and get behind it. But we also need to raise that debate to the political level and make it a political issue continually, and particularly during election campaigns.
Thanks, Sharon. Angela, did you want to add?
I suppose because I work from such a more localised level, the relationships, again, it's a relational, it's a shared understanding, is bringing our local politicians, our council, along the journey with us as well. And so they are invited to many of the activities that we facilitate or host. They are invited to our meetings, they're invited to everything really. And if they're unable to attend because they're very busy people, certainly I like to go and visit and knock on the door and say, have a coffee and just a yarn, and, you know.
Great.
Keep them emotionally and, you know, intellectually attached to what's happening within the community.
That's great. That actually sort of flows into the next.
Sorry, could I just add too, you know, there are solutions to the problems that we're talking about, or the challenges we're talking about. You know, Angela's talked about those local solutions, there are policy solutions. So it's not as though this is an impossible task. It's about coming together to have the conversation and then to act, because there are ways that we can overcome these challenges.
Yeah, I think, Sharon, as you said, Anti-Poverty Week is such a great opportunity to do that, and I will encourage everyone to go to the Anti-Poverty Week website. It's fantastic. There's so much information there, and some of these really practical ways that people can get involved or learn more. So that's really great. But also, like what you were saying, Angela, I think does lead a little bit to the next question. We always get questions about this. It's so important. Is you know, how do we help the voices of children to reach the people who are making decisions? And yeah, so you've talked a bit about how you do that at a local level, and I think that someone had also asked, are they interested? So how do you find that? And then I'll go to Sharon, because I know you've done a lot of work in how do you get your research to those decision makers.
Yeah, I think people are interested. Yeah, and it's about how you tell the story too. So, you know, my relationship with the important community members, our, like I said, politicians and council, business people, is about my relationship with them, and then how I share the yarning. So, and people are interested, definitely. They're interested in the outcomes, and they're interested in the different way of engaging with communities as well. I think often as funded service delivery providers, we do get focused on the silo and the needs, you know, the needs of what we have to achieve in relation to our commitment to the dollars we have, and how many boxes that we need to fit people into, or tick or don't tick. So finding a different lens, that narrative and that story around building wealth using community and decentralizing ourselves allows us to bring everyone into the story and the conversation.
Sharon, did you want to add a little more? I know it's a sort of area of expertise for you.
I mean, I must say, I love the way Angela talks about wealth as social wealth as well as economic wealth. You know, and wealth comes to us in many ways, and it's important to keep that in mind, I think, and to understand that because economic wealth might not exist in a community, there may be extraordinary social wealth. In terms of, you know, that issue of how we help to bring the voices of children to decision makers. I guess that's really at the heart of the focus of our research. And the research that we do is generally qualitative research. It's participatory research with children that uses methods that they can engage with and the children usually really enjoy, to be able to talk about what are really difficult subjects in a space that feels very safe for those children. And we aim to do that in a way that is as rigorous and as robust as possible, because we want to be able to build the evidence base. And I think, sharing children's quotes and their experiences and their stories is always incredibly powerful. And when we've spoken to policymakers, in public servants and politicians across the board, people can't help but be moved when they hear children talking about what it feels like to be hungry, or what it feels like to be throwing away excursion notes that they desperately want to go on because they know their parents can't afford it. At a human level, we all are touched when we hear those stories. But we also aim to ensure that around those stories is the really rigorous research. So it's not anecdotal, and anecdotes are always important, but it also is about the research base. And our experience, like Angela's, is that people are interested. But often when priorities start to compete as decisions are made, things get lost. And so it's how do we keep that evidence, front and centre, and how do we keep those experiences front and centre? And I also just wanted to comment, I think the question was about whether other people are interested, but I just wanted to comment on whether children are interested. And we find in the research that we do that, and as I said, we're usually working with quite young children, so 7 to 12 or 13. And this is the group of middle childhood that's often missing. Now, we often really focus on early childhood for all good reasons. We focus on young people as they move into high school and then into work and those points of transition, but that middle group is often missing. And this group of children, the children that we've worked with, they are so interested. They want to talk about not just their own experiences, but they want to talk about social justice. They want to talk about the kinds of communities they want to see, not just for themselves, but for others. And they have phenomenally good ideas about how we can do that and how we can connect people. So they are really interested, and it's worth our while listening to them.
Great. It's so, the anecdotes are so compelling. During National Child Protection Week, we had an art project, and we asked adults working with children or individuals, but mostly collaborative pieces to do artworks about what they thought their community needed and what a safe community looked like to them. And the responses were so beautiful, and all of our staff became quite obsessed with these these beautiful artworks and wanting to, so I might share those in the resource sheet as well. But it's great to know that there's, you're behind the sort of doing that important research to back it up as well. So it's all nice to have pretty pictures. But I think what you said earlier also, Sharon, was that the children know so much more than people generally think they know. So that's, and you would see that, I guess, too, Angela.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's so important, Sharon, you're right, to bring children's voices into it. And yeah, that's it.
This is similar, but just about getting your research to policymakers or your projects. Like, I think that's part of your work, I guess, Sharon, and working in a university. And Angela, I guess things like the award might help. But if you had either of you had sort of information about or advice about that, how do we reach people?
I suppose, no, I was going to, just for us, we do have to report outcomes and opportunities. So our quarterly and annual reporting is really rigorous around how we share the information, the learning, and the understandings that we've collected in our journeys.
We were in the work that we do, we will normally present that work in different ways. We're academics, so that that evidence base is around the peer-reviewed journal articles that are often quite dense, that are often quite long, and often behind paywalls, so not everyone can access them. But we then also take that work, and that's important in terms of the evidence base, because it's reviewed by other researchers, and if something isn't robust, it's called out, and it should be. But then we also produce kind of discussion papers and often little videos. I think, Helen, you've got one of those little videos that we've got to share, just sort of snapshots and sound bites that are really easily accessible, because members of Parliament are incredibly busy. So to convey a message to them, you know, it needs to be really short and sharp. But we also do always aim to do quite a lot of work with people who are working in the public sector, public servants, who need the evidence base that we're able to provide to be able to make decisions. And so those relationships become really important to have, or to aim to have ongoing conversations around the work that we do. And I guess I'd just also add to that, I think for the work that we do in universities, the other part of it that is incredibly important is through our teaching. So we do a lot of research-led teaching, and we share with our students you know, what we're finding in our research and how we can think differently and better about policy. And of course, that's so important because our students today are decision makers tomorrow. And so I think we often miss that, but that's such a fundamentally important part of communicating our research. And that's often where I've got such hope, because we have some phenomenally engaged, bright students who want to go out and make the world a better place.
That's great. I've got a question here, and we did talk a little bit about that narrative changing, and people are really interested in that. So someone has asked if there's a better way to have conversations about poverty with the general public, and I know that Tony from Anti-Poverty Week would be a really good person to speak at this sort of thing. We will add a little bit more information, but whether, yeah, how do we better kind of communicate these things with the public? And this person pointed out things like, I guess, multidimensional is a little bit of a complex term, and whether you, Sharon, if you've had different ways that you've talked about this when you sort of reaching the general public.
Yeah, I think that we are always guilty of slipping into language that means something to us and doesn't necessarily mean something to everyone. We hope, and I'd be really keen to hear people's thoughts on this. So if we don't have the chance today, if people want to email me, we're always keen to hear from people, you know, or to contact by Twitter or LinkedIn or whatever, because we think that idea of the material basics, opportunities to participate, play and learn, and to have strong and supportive relationships is a really clear way of communicating what we need to ensure all children have, and to think about the way in which poverty stops all children from having that. So we think that language it's a bit more, it's longer than multidimensional poverty, but we think it probably has more meaning for people. I think it's a great question how we have these conversations, because we need to be so careful that we don't have conversations in ways that reinforce, you know, the stigma and the shame that is often around poverty. And for us, when we talk about these issues, we aim to always recognise the strengths of children, of their families, of their communities. And it takes an awful lot to survive in a context of poverty. It takes enormous strength, and it takes enormous creativity and innovation. And I think we need to talk about that. And we need to talk about the structural causes of poverty and the experience of poverty. I mean, we never talk about poor people or poor children or poor families, because that's creating a narrative that is about laying the responsibility of with those individuals. Whereas when we talk about the nature of poverty, that's a situation that exists and happens to people. And we've just seen over the past 18 months, you know, when certain circumstances occur, any of us could find ourselves in poverty. You know, we could lose our job, we could lose our home. Angela talked about people experiencing homelessness who've never experienced it before. So poverty is not something that happens to those poor people who have done something wrong. Poverty is a social condition that can happen to any of us and that we can stop. And there's been some really great work in the UK done around shifting the narrative away from that blame.
I will share that UK poverty framing stuff. It's really amazing. They use terms like unlock, and they are very careful to talk about things like poverty or the economy as systems that we have built we can change. They don't just exist out there like air. But Angela, you probably have examples of how you talk about these things. When you're talking to the communities, you would be using the word poverty, I guess. So
no, I never use the word poverty. I really agree with how Sharon described it. The only thing I would add really is it is about the dignity of individuals or the people, the community, the families that we're working with, and I would never so it's just, and if I have to talk about poverty, I would rather talk about wealth.
Yeah.
And how do we build wealth rather than just coming from the deficit. So if I'm talking about poverty, I'd rather talk about it in terms of wealth. So where do we look for our wealth, and how do we find the wealth, and what wealth do we already have in our lives?
That's amazing, and that's we do have quite a few questions, and we also are going to share this short video that we have that sort of explains. I mean, we're all experts now, Sharon's research, but we will share the little summary video. It's really a lovely way of sort of reiterating those dimensions. And but maybe we'll start to wrap it up in terms of the questions, and then I think we've come across a lot more things that I'm thinking I need to share afterwards as well. So there's another great bit of research that's been done called Passing the Message Stick, which talks about how do we talk about First Nations issues in a positive way, and it's quite new and it's really amazing. It gives really clear instructions about how to do that. So that issue of language, and I'm a comms person, so there's sort of an area that I'm interested in, and I think it's been a really important thing today. But do either of you have something that you would love to say? We've still got a little bit of time, but if you wanted to just add a little wrap up.
Could I maybe add two things? One, it may have just gone from my head, but one is, I think that point that Angela made is so important, that when working with communities and engaging with communities, not labelling and not using that language of poverty, that's, and in our research, we don't use the language of poverty when we're talking with children. We talk about what makes strong communities, what happens when those things are missing, what's missing, and frame it in a positive way. And I think this is a difficult thing to work through about how we use that language. But I do think we need to use the language of poverty, not with communities or particular groups of society, but I think we need to use the language of poverty when we are talking about the structural and systemic problems that we face in Australia, because if we don't name it at that level, we can't address it. And we talk a lot about well-being, and that is so fundamentally important. But thinking about well-being alone won't get us to the place where we end poverty. It may be part of it, but I think we need to also explicitly talk about how we end poverty. And so I think it's different types of conversations in different places. And so I think that's a message that I would kind of leave with at the end. And the final point that I did want to make is that I think we often make the mistake in Australia, as in many other countries, of thinking that of somehow confusing neglect and poverty. And if we think about the child protection system and the removal of children from their families, the problem at the heart of the issue is often poverty, not neglect. And often when children are then removed, so much more harm is done. And if we think about that work we're doing around those 3 dimensions, opportunity and relational deprivation often come about because of a particular response to material deprivation. And that's a whole nother conversation, but I just wanted to raise it for people to think about, that we must not respond to poverty by assuming it's neglect and removing children and punishing families.
Thank you, Sharon. I think that is a conversation that maybe we'd even talked about earlier on, and there's so much else to talk about today, but I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because it is certainly something that NAPCAN's been really interested in talking about. So yeah, maybe that is another conversation for another day, but thank you. And Angela, have you got something?
I suppose for me, it's all relational in terms, and it's practice, and it's ongoing. So there's no, in terms of the working communities, and it's not, there's no end time. It's an ongoing practice. Yeah. So
yeah,
and it's about relationships and the importance of relationships.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Building the social wealth, the social capital, and yeah.
It sounds like you've done an amazing job of doing that in your community, and that's yeah. No, it's really wonderful, and they're lucky to have you. Thank you both again. I will let you go about your days, but thank you, Sharon and Angela, so much, because I know it was it was kind of shortish notice and a little bit of rearranging, and it was exactly the conversation we'd kind of hoped for. So I'm really it's been really nice to have you. And now I'm just going to blab on a little. I'll turn you guys off, and I'll blab on a little bit about Anti-Poverty Week and direct people to some of the things. Some of the things that would be great to get involved with this week. Yeah, if you haven't, I think in the chat now there is some information there about Anti-Poverty Week. If people haven't had a look at that site, as I said, it's really great. There's an events page, things going on in every state. There are like some coordinating groups in the different states, but all of it should be on that Anti-Poverty Week website. I see that they're already getting quite a lot of good media, and there's some really interesting stories coming up. We shared one from today, from The Guardian this morning, that's really relevant to today's conversation, and that was about the effect of poverty on children being able to participate in things like paid activities. So we all know that things like sports and clubs and are quite expensive, and they show, this particular piece showed that the advantages for children living in poverty were of course particularly great, but they were the ones who were missing out on those opportunities. So that's an interesting one. Sharon is in another webinar tomorrow with the Brotherhood of St. Lawrence, and that you can find that one on the Anti-Poverty Week website. She's with Sharon Goldfeld, who's another person that NAPCAN follows and has had involved in conversations. So I think that'll be a really good one. It'll be a little bit different to today. So yeah, if you're in on a roll, go to that one as well. I think we also mentioned a couple of times there are some particular campaigns that are being supported through Anti-Poverty Week. So have a look at that, particularly social housing and Raise the Rate. I also really love the school resources. So in September, Anti-Poverty Week released some school resources. So these help teachers to have to teach students about poverty and inequality in Australia. So there's some things for primary and secondary schools. So if you're involved with schools, take a look at those. I think that's anyway, you can browse around there. I think we've also shared a Fast Facts PDF that's about poverty and children and families. So if you're wondering about particular stats and things, that's the place to go. Then, of course, next week is Children's Week, and we had a little bit of conversation today about children's rights. Children's Week is very much about supporting the rights of children, and this year the theme is based on Article 15. Article 15 is about children having the right of associations. So choosing their own friends, joining groups, and once again, it does link into what we were talking about today in terms of the opportunities and the participation. So have a look at the Children's Week things. It's run differently or independently in each state. So if you go to childrensweek.org.au, you'll find links to each state. So we're really lucky here in Queensland. We have a really great Children's Week. Because I'm here, I'll just do a little plug. We have a really great Children's Week program up here under the Children's Rights Queensland, which is an organisation that's funded through the QFCC. So if you're in Queensland, take a look at that site. We've got some even new children's book and some posters and lots of really great events. So yeah, plenty of things. I know you're all very busy, but there's some really important conversations to be had. And NAPCAN is hoping to run a webinar during Children's Week as well, so keep an eye out for that. Now I'll just click play on the video, and anyone who's still here, if you want to, we put the link in the chat so you can watch it in your own time or use that as a way to finish off. So thank you, everybody.